This conversation will be 45 minutes with Mr. King, and then we'll move to a dialogue with the audience. We ask that your questions be succinct and questions. Is that a veiled threat? Well, the literary police is standing all on the side. If you would take a moment to put your cell phones in the off position, we'd appreciate it. And in the last day of our closing of our forums for the 2018 season, I absolutely want to thank my partner in crime, Catherine Randazzo, who has led our literary team along with Jordan, Alex, Melanie, Mary, and so many to provide the forums. I'd like to thank Georgia Court, who's been a big sponsor, Ina Schnell, who is here, who's been a huge sponsor of the forums and allowed this to happen. And last but not least, in the room, in the building, is Mr. Charles Clapsaddle with METV, who has taken the time, the effort, and the discipline and talent to film these so we have them for posterity and others to see. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce you to a colleague, and I'm privileged to say a good friend of mine. Chief Judge Charles Williams has been not only a great judge, but a great citizen of our community. We are absolutely lucky to have him in our midst with all of the work that he does that's in your programs. He's also on the board of directors at Florida Studio Theater, and on the forums, he's chair of our steering committee and responsible for this platform of thought that we enjoy. So without further ado, please welcome to introduce Mr. King, Chief Judge Charles Williams. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for that introduction, and thank all of you for coming out tonight, especially all of those I goaded and baited and asked that you show up. The news when it came was short and sweet. Standing on a Florida golf course in 2013, Gilbert King looked at his phone and saw a 2-word text message from an old friend. Dude, Pulitzer. In 2013, Gilbert King was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction for Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and The Dawn of a New America, a richly detailed chronicle of racial injustice in the Florida town of Groveland in 1949. Involving 4 black men falsely accused of rape, drawing future Supreme Court Justice, but then civil rights lawyer Thurgood Marshall into the battle. His latest book takes us back to Lake County, Florida, and is a true story of violence, race, and justice. Beneath a Ruthless Sun, a true story of violence, race, and justice, lost and found, and we will define that lost and found as we go through this. So at this time, please welcome to Florida Studio Theater, Gilbert King. I'd like to start this discussion by reading an excerpt, Gilbert, from a New York Times review of Beneath a Ruthless Sun by Jeffrey Toobin. Quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long," Martin Luther King Jr. famously asserted, "but it bends towards justice." Well, perhaps. An alternative view is that progress on civil rights in the United States has been episodic and inconsistent, with victory often followed by backlash. The poisonous aftermath of the Supreme Court's great decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 forms the backdrop to Gilbert King's superb new book, Beneath a Ruthless Sun. Rather than accept the justice's unanimous edict on school integration, much of the South responded with defiance in the courts and violence in the streets, especially in the backwoods. Florida has largely escaped the criticism heaped on other states of the old Confederacy, but it's to the Sunshine State that King returns with a story of mind-boggling racism and cruelty. So the issues raised by Jeffrey Toobin in this review will be examined in more detail as we proceed, but I would like to have the author at this time, if you could read a short excerpt from the book to set the scene for us, please.
Also, I just want to say thank you for having me back here. I had a great time last time I was here, about 3 or 4 years ago, and I want to take Charles on the road with me. He's such a great interviewer, and I want to thank Kate for having me back again. I feel like these are real special friendships that I've made over the years. And so when she invited me to come back, I couldn't wait to get down here. So thank you. I'll set this up a little bit. This is the story. In chapter 1, there's a very big citrus freeze. And so this is a community in Lake County which is really deeply affected by this freeze. It's really, the estimates are that 75% of the fruit was going to be damaged. And it centers around a young boy by the name of Jesse Daniels, 19 years old, but really he had the mental capacity, doctors said, of a 10-year-old. And because all the community members were expected to chip in on this freeze and the last-minute harvesting of fruit to try and save it, Jesse's mother, Pearl Daniels, dresses him up, and he can't even afford gloves. They didn't even have gloves for Jesse, so they put 2 pairs of socks on his hand and sent him out there, and he helped build soil banks to protect the trees and to pick the inside of the oranges. And it was a very dangerous time. A lot of the fruit growers were very nervous that they were going to lose their entire crop in December of 1957. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the out-of-towners who come to Lake County to pick and make money, the itinerant farm workers, and also about this criminal case that you'll be being teased about a little bit here. Most of the laborers had arrived in Lake County without money for a return trip, and they had depended on their first week's wages to cover their rent and living expenses. Local police, overwhelmed by requests for food, pointed the desperate itinerants to the King's Daughters, a charitable organization. Mable was moved both by the workers' plight and by the quiet work of the charity, which provided bus fares and gasoline for stranded families, as well as mattresses for workers who were sleeping on the bare floors of houses without electric light or heat. And Mable Norris Reese is the local reporter who's covering this freeze. But as the weather had quickly returned to more than seasonable temperatures, what would have become known as the 1957 freeze was almost as rapidly receding from newspaper headlines into history. So when in the wee hours of December 18th, only a couple hours before her normal Wednesday routine would have begun, rumors of a white woman's rape began to circulate. Mable was free to follow her repertorial instincts. They took her to Okahumpka, where she'd heard that residents of North Quarters were being harassed. There, she found that Sheriff McCall's deputies were not only terrorizing the residents, but also arresting on suspicion virtually every young black male in the neighborhood. One of them described how Negro suspects were being rounded up and taken in by up to 5 carloads at a time. They woke me up at 2 a.m. and told me I would get the electric chair if they didn't kill me beforehand, he said. Another Oklahoma resident told Mable, they took in 33 of our menfolk, not just men, but boys too. A body couldn't do anything but wait for him to come pounding on the door. By daybreak, Mable had pages of notes to transcribe, and they reverberated with fear that once again the Lake County Sheriff's Department was indiscriminately rounding up young black men, and that once again violence would come of it. A restlessness began to run through the quarters, Mable wrote, and it mounted steadily. Meanwhile, over at the county courthouse in Tavares, deputies James Yates and Leroy Campbell were interrogating an endless stream of suspects. Ethel Cope, a 53-year-old maid from Okahumpka, showed up for work that Wednesday morning after a sleepless, uneasy night, worried that her nephew, 18-year-old Sam Wiley Odom, was one of them. She described to her employees how all night long deputies had ransacked black homes, busting in and throwing furniture around in the name of the law. One of the young men they picked up in the initial sweep was Sam. Ethel Cope had good reason to worry about her nephew. The victim was not just any white woman. She was Joe Knowles' 31-year-old wife, Blanche Bosanquet Knowles, mother of 3 young children. Later on Wednesday, Deputy Yates began eliminating some of the suspects who'd been hauled off to jail for questioning. Sam Wiley Odom was not among them. Yates hadn't liked some of the Odom's boys' answers, and he'd cast a hard eye on the teenager sitting so calmly behind bars. He persuaded McCall to engage the services of Lieutenant William Donaldson, a polygraph examiner from the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department in Tampa, to aid in the interrogations. Meanwhile, Sam Wiley Odom wouldn't be talking to any lawyers or receiving any family visitors. The boy was going to have to start being more cooperative. He was going to have to start telling Yates the truth. And so that's the initial suspect who's picked up in this is a young man by the name of Sam Wiley Odom. And you'll see as it goes on, there's a couple little twists within the Lake County Sheriff's Department that really, if I put them in a novel, I don't think people would believe what happened with this, but
Let me start with the first basic question that I was just curious. The title, Beneath a Ruthless Sun.
Okay. This is actually a pretty funny story. I haven't really told it yet. But I wanted this one for Devil in the Grove, and the publisher rejected it. It's based on a James Weldon Johnson poem about the 100-year anniversary of the end of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was just this beautiful poem, and it could not have been more appropriate because James Weldon Johnson was a Florida poet, but he's also the first African-American admitted to the Florida bar. He was one of the founders of the NAACP. So it was really the perfect person, a Florida person, poet. And I just loved this Beneath a Ruthless Sun. And my last publisher said, we don't like that title at all. And but, you know, you win a Pulitzer, they kind of bow to you a little bit more. Using that next time.
Now, obviously, and I'm sure many people here have if not all, and they should if they haven't, read Devil in the Grove. Tell us a little bit about this book and what's the difference and what's the same about that book.
Well, that's a really great question. I mean, I think the interesting thing is, like, this is not a subject I really wanted to return to. I definitely didn't want to return to the same county because these books take 5 years. So I thought 5 years living with Sheriff McCall and his deputies was really quite enough. And you know, and then all of a sudden I was at a book signing in Groveland in 2012, and this elderly deputy came up to me with a business card, and he kind of stuck it like right in my face, and all I could read was Sheriff of Lake County. And I was like, oh boy, who's this? And then I recognized his name on the card, and I realized I had written about him in the book because he was a deputy with a conscience. And there was 2 African Americans who were being framed for rape in 1960. It didn't end after Groveland. They kept doing things. They were being framed for a rape that they did not commit in 1960, and they were just a couple days away from going to the electric chair, and Deputy Evie Griffin turned in his fellow deputies for manufacturing evidence. And he said to me, you got your book right, but you didn't get the whole story. There's a lot more to tell. And he went on to tell me the story of this case that had been haunting him. He said, you know, we framed an innocent 19-year-old kid of a rape he did not commit, and it was haunting him. And he said, nobody's going to talk to you about this. This is not like Groveland. This is a very delicate subject matter. And I was curious about it, and I started thinking maybe it's an article, a follow-up, or what happened after Lake County, the Groveland Story 8 years later. And I started filing Freedom of Information Act requests and talking to more and more people. And after several months, it became obvious to me that this was a standing novel or a standing nonfiction narrative on its own, a book-length form. I thought some of the things in here I could not believe I was learning. So you talk about what's the same. Well, it's still based on the accusations of a rape, and that was a common theme that pops up in the Jim Crow South. It was used to sort of housekeeping and control populations and maybe get rid of some of the bad guys or the uppity guys in local neighborhoods, come up with these false charges. This case is a completely different story, and a story I've never really heard before in any of the research I've done. In this particular case, this wealthy white woman, Blanche Bosanquet Knowles, reports that she has been raped by an African American with bushy hair. And so the deputies come in and they round up all these African American suspects. And then something very strange begins to happen. The husband, who's been out of town on business, comes home, and he basically makes it clear to the powers that be that it just wouldn't do for his wife Blanche to have been raped by an African American. And so they find a white mentally disabled kid and frame him so that they would have the story. And so this book is really all about unraveling this particular crime case. But as Charles said when he was reading the Jeffrey Toobin review, to really understand how something like this was possible and why it was possible, you have to understand what was happening in America. And that was really the aftermath of Brown versus Board.
And the odd thing, and we'll I'm sure have more questions about that, is that when you think about the novel that, okay, someone is being set up in Lake County by Sheriff McCall for a rape, the obvious idea is that it's an African-American male. But in this case, it was not. Absolutely.
And in fact, when they first approached Sheriff McCall, he didn't understand it. He's one of his deputies said, he's all for hanging a Negro in this case. What are we doing? And it was made clear to them that we need a white suspect. And there were some very powerful people in line that sort of made this happen, including the state attorney, the judge, and Jesse Daniels' own defense lawyer was in on the conspiracy. So it's something that you just can't even imagine. I don't think you could put this in a TV series because no one would believe that.
And I think it's important for everyone to understand that we're talking about 1950s Florida. So let's talk about a little bit about what the climate was in Lake County and actually throughout the South in the 1950s. And then if you could, how could some individual sheriff, in this case Sheriff McCall, wield so much power?
Okay, I'll start with the first part of the question first. You know, it really was the aftermath of Brown versus Board. But I have to say, when I looked around the rest of the South, the reaction in Florida was more heated than anywhere else in the South. And you can look at that because they had a very big integration case. Virgil Hawkins was this African-American man from, believe it or not, Okahumpka, the same little town of about 300 people. Just to give you some background, when Norma Paget in Devil in the Grove turns up on the side of the road and makes those accusations that she's been abducted and raped by 4 African Americans, she does this in Okahumpka at this same intersection where Virgil Hawkins lives and is trying to integrate the University of Florida College law. And the U.S. Supreme, after Brown, this is like 1956, mandates that Florida accept Virgil Hawkins into the Florida Law School. And Florida does something that really no other state had the gumption to do. They just refused to obey the Supreme Court mandate. So, Thurgood Marshall called this a second undeclared civil war. They were refusing to obey the Supreme Court mandate. And so Virgil Hawkins was not permitted to attend the University of Florida. Ultimately, the pressure got so bad that they forced the University of Florida to accept this Supreme Court decision. And the Florida Supreme Court said, okay, you can let African Americans into the University of Florida Law School, but Virgil Hawkins is not going to be one of them. They made it personal, and they made him withdraw his application. And so he did so to sacrifice his own legal career so that other African Americans could attend the University of Florida. And so this was the case. The Virgil Hawkins case was one of the cases. It was also the Groveland case, the clemency for Walter Irvin. Governor Leroy Collins pardoned Walter Irvin in the Groveland from the death sentence. So these were the 2 major campaign issues in 1956, Virgil Hawkins and the pardon of Walter Irvin, both of them in Okahumpka. So Lake County was controlling the entire election. Everything was focused in that 56 election on race in Okahumpka.
And as we go into Lake County in this post-Brown era, what was the role of Sheriff McCall in terms of the citrus industry there and in terms of enforcing what can only be called white supremacy?
Right, and Sheriff Willis McCall, he was put into power by the powerful citrus barons and also by the electorate. And he had a 28-year reign in Lake County, despite all the violence and all the murders. But when you look at these towns these counties like Lake County, they often had a very powerful sheriff. And they were only answerable to the electorate and the people that put them into power. And so they wielded a tremendous amount of power, and you did not want to be on the wrong side of the sheriff. And I think this is one of the things I noticed when I was working on this book. I had heard people talk about this, but in order to support the structure of white supremacy, not only were blacks brutalized within that system, but whites had to compromise their morality and their integrity. They were expected to perjure themselves in order to go along with these criminal cases. They were expected to testify and lie in court, and they were expected to not attend public schools with African Americans after Brown versus Board. And so it was debasing to the entire population. And it reminded me of a quote that Thurgood Marshall said, which never really resonated with me until I was really working on this book. He said, racism benefits no one. And clearly it did benefit a lot of white people in the Jim Crow era. But what he was getting at with that statement, I thought, was that this is going to hurt many of you too. And that really became clear with this Jesse Daniels case.
The power that was wielded by Sheriff McCall, obviously there were other people in the power structure that had to either go along with what McCall was or were frightened of him. And this goes all the way up until the governor's office. And in the 50s, there's a governor who a lot of people considered, for Florida at the time, rather progressive, and that's Governor Leroy Collins. Can you talk about that relationship that the governor had with what was going on in Lake City during this time?
Right, and that's an interesting point because, you know, sometimes you think about it, you read these stories and go, well, this is a really bad sheriff, he's a racist, his deputies are racist, these are bad apples. These weren't bad apples. These guys got away with this so many times. Sheriff McCall was investigated 49 times on civil rights charges, and he beat every single one of them. And the reason he was able to beat them is because people at higher levels of government had his back, from state attorneys to judges to the U.S. attorney, and all the way up to the governor. I mean, you had several governors who were openly in the Klan at one point in their life. McCall had the goods on them as well, and so they didn't want to investigate him. And so McCall liked to brag that he'd beaten 49 civil rights cases. So it was really this structure. It wasn't just one or two bad law enforcement people. Every layer of government had his back and enabled him to continue this enforcement of white supremacy because no one paid a political price for this. It actually emboldened him.
Let's talk about a character in the book who, if there's a hero, if there's a devil, it's definitely Sheriff McCall, but if there's a hero in the book, it's a woman by the name of Mable Norris Reese. Could you talk about her for a few moments?
Yeah, and what I liked about Mable was Mable is this reporter for a local weekly newspaper, the Mount Dora Topic. She runs it with her husband. And if you remember in Devil in the Grove, if you read that book, she starts out kind of on Willis McCall's side. Not kind of, she was on Willis McCall's side. She was calling for the execution of these Groveland boys within days before a trial. And she'd write articles that this young woman's honor will be avenged before any of the facts were known. And so when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that verdict in the Groveland case, they actually specifically pointed to Mabel's biased reporting. And so after that Supreme Court case was overturned and there's an automatic retrial, Sheriff Willis McCall drives up to Rayford State Prison and has to pick up the two defendants on the evening of the retrial, and he ends up killing one of them on the side of the road and wounding the other, Walter Irvin. And at that point, Mable just kind of has this awakening that she couldn't abide by this anymore. And she determines from that moment on that she's going to report on Sheriff Willis McCall and his deputies and their civil rights abuses and their brutality. And she becomes an enemy of Willis McCall. And Willis McCall calls her Red Mable. She's a communist. You can't believe a word she said. And he's basically gaslighting her at every single moment, telling the FBI she needs to be investigated. She's an out-and-out communist. And while Mable is starting to have this awakening, she's reporting on Brown. She's saying we here in Lake County need to cooperate with the Supreme Court decision. This is the law of the land, and she's calling for patience and gradual acceptance. And she's getting crosses burned on her lawn. The Klan poisons her dog. They throw bombs at her house. They deface her business and vandalize it. And then the last straw, they ruin her newspaper economically. Willis McCall goes around and threatens all of her advertisers and said, you can no longer advertise with Mabel's paper. And they run her out of town to Daytona Beach. But she goes to Daytona Beach and she gets an editorial job for the Daytona Beach News Journal, and she keeps writing about Willis McCall. And she just stays on him. And refuses to back down. And I think that's one of the great parts of the book is that all these male reporters were absolutely afraid of Willis McCall. And they were social with him, and they were terrified of him. And Mable wasn't scared. She was the only one who was reporting on all of these abuses.
And we know from the introduction, and also those who have read the book, we know that Jesse Daniels is set up for this rape. In your book, you also explore what happens with Jesse Daniels and also really take the lid off of what occurs at Chattahoochee, which is the state mental institution in Florida. First of all, talk about how Jesse ended up there, and then talk about the things that you found out about Chattahoochee as you explored this book.
Well, one of the things is they didn't really have any evidence against Jesse Daniels. They tried to manufacture a few things, but it was scant. And so they ended up, Willis McCall decided he needed a confession. And so he pulled out a gun and held it to Jesse's hand and asked him to sign a piece of paper, which Jesse did, just absolutely terrified. And because they didn't have enough evidence, they knew they couldn't go to trial with this case. And so they did something that's even more heinous, in my opinion. They just said he's not going to get a hearing, he's not going to get a trial. We're just going to commit him to Chattahoochee and declare him an insane and unable to defend himself. And so the interesting thing in this case is the victim, Blanche Bosanquet Knowles, doesn't want to testify to this because she's already said that she was sexually assaulted by an African American with bushy hair. And she doesn't want to get caught up in this. And I think the state attorney knew the safest way to avoid a trial was to just ship him off to Chattahoochee. Now they have their official story. Chattahoochee was no place you want to be. It was worse than the state prisons. You had patients there, overwhelmed the number of doctors that could care for you. I think it was 1,200 to every doctor. You would go years without seeing them. They were doing lobotomies. They were doing shock therapy. They were doping patients with Thorazine just to manage them. And here you have Jesse Daniels, who sleeps with a teddy bear at night with the mind, IQ of about 55 and the mind of a 10-year-old child, and he's away from his mother for the first time in his life, in with the most violent offenders that Chattahoochee could offer. So it was a pretty terrifying place to be.
And the question becomes, even in 1950s Florida, how could the justice system have allowed that to happen? What happened and what went wrong with that?
I think it was just a matter of becoming overwhelmed with patients. After World War II, you had a lot of patients with, it wasn't diagnosed then, PTSD. But I think they called it shell shock even in the 50s. But there was clearly all these returning veterans who were traumatized, and they were clogging up all the mental institutes. And these mental institutes just didn't have the resources. So when you look at the photographs and you just see people, with no clothes, just huddled in the corner, they're horrible sights to see. And Florida, like many other states across the country, just were not prepared for this influx of patients. And they just didn't have the medical care to be able to handle and treat patients. So they basically warehoused them. And mental institutes, sadly, were being used as a weapon in law enforcement, which is what happened to Jesse. Just hide away some of these criminals.
Without going into too much detail, obviously his mother attempted to get him released from Chattahoochee. What were some of her attempts, and what were some of the ways she reached out to people to try to save her son?
Yeah, and this was another thing that it was so great to be able to work on a book where actually women are doing really important things. Jesse's mother she can't afford a lawyer. She's a poor dirt farmer, basically, who picks watermelons in town. Jesse's her only child. Her husband is 25 years older than them, a disabled World War I vet. And they live in this very tiny shack in a very poor section of Okahumpka. And she knows she can't afford an attorney. And Jesse Daniels this is a capital case, even though they really weren't sending white suspects or convicted criminals to the electric chair for rape. This is a serious charge hanging over her son's head, and she can't afford a lawyer. She has to rely on the courts to appoint one, which tremendously backfired in this case. So she just starts investigating the case on her own. And working with Mable, she starts giving Mable more and more clues, things she's heard in the watermelon fields, going around taking a petition, to sign for people to say, Jesse's a good boy, he would never do this, and talking to people. And she starts getting some really important clues. And then she strikes up this correspondence with J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. And the remarkable thing is, Hoover actually starts writing her back after a few letters. And Hoover has some legal advice for her, saying you need to once the trial comes about, you have to get a legal aid attorney and they will help you with this case. And she's like, no, you don't understand. They're in on the conspiracy too. They're all bad. I need help. I need a civil rights investigation. And, Hoover's like, oh, that can't possibly be. And she says, it's Christmas. My boy is away again. I need help. And finally, I think Hoover is just so annoyed and such a nuisance that he says, oh, fine, open up a civil rights investigation. And he does. And that's a moment where the case begins to turn, because now Mable is empowered with evidence and investigators coming into town. And so it's just this beautiful relationship of these two women who could not be more different. The sophisticated northern reporter and, the dirt farmer and melon picker and Mable and Pearl. But they fish together, they strike up this friendship, and it's all about trying to get justice for Jesse.
Before we talk about the reason someone would want to set up Jesse, what were some of the clues and evidence that pointed away from Jesse to other people or other suspects that were either ignored, covered up, or manufactured?
And there's quite a bit of it. I think the most telling clue in this whole thing, the evidence, is that after the sexual assault, Blanche is sort of cooperating because she's got 3 children in her room and she's trying to protect her children. One of the babies is in the crib next to the bed, and she has 2 boys down the hall, and she's trying to get this intruder, this attacker, out of her house. And so she's using calming words and trying to get him to leave, and she doesn't want this to escalate into an even more violent encounter. And her attacker says, just as he's about to leave, he says, "A man paid me $5,000 to kill you tonight. Don't you want to know who that man is?" And Blanche says, "Well, yes, if it will get you out of the house faster." And she immediately regrets that. And he looks at her and says, "Don't you be sly to me. Now I'm not telling you." And he leaves. Now, the remarkable thing about this is Blanche writes an 8-page statement that she gives to the state attorney. She doesn't mention anything about a stutter. Jesse Daniels cannot go 2 sentences without a vicious, obvious stutter. And everybody in town knew Jesse Daniels, including Blanche. She would have known that this was her attacker. And she said nothing about a white attacker or anyone who stuttered. She described her attacker as an African American with bushy hair. And so that is the most obvious. And obviously the state attorney tried to make that transcript disappear. And it did disappear for 2 decades. It turned up later when I was doing research. I found it in one of the FBI reports. So it did turn up, but they tried to hide that, and they tried to hide a lot of evidence, incriminating evidence in this railroading.
And they actually manufactured evidence.
Oh, they did. In fact, this was one of the moments where Evie Griffin, the deputy who told me about this story, and he said to me, we framed him. Deputy James Yates went to Jesse Daniels' house. Jesse played the guitar, and he took some of his guitar picks and moved him over to Blanche Knowles' house and placed him there. And I never found any evidence of this, and I'm thinking maybe Evie doesn't really quite know what he's talking about. And then I started looking at the confession, and the confession in Blanche's statement mentions that the suspect dropped something, maybe a small piece of wood. She couldn't tell what it was, and he started searching for it. And that confession was written by a deputy, and they were using that confession to solidify the evidence against Jesse Daniels. And it was just things like that. They stole undershorts from his house, planted it at the crime scene. They were very practiced at this. They'd done this many times, and they got away with it every time.
In fact, not only in the Groveland case, but this case, there was a modus operandi for Sheriff McCall and his deputies in extracting confessions. Could you share with the audience what the usual mode of extracting confessions from suspects, usually African-American suspects?
Right. I mean, they had, there's a lot of different things that McCall did, and some of them were very violent. I talk about some of the cases up in a cabin, which you can read about in I think it's one of the 3rd or 4th chapter. But if you go back to the Groveland case, after the Groveland trial, Sheriff Willis McCall has gotten some heat that maybe these confessions might not be real. And so he summons the youngest of the defendants, 16-year-old Charles Greenlee, brings him into his office, turns on a tape recorder, and puts a gun right to his head and starts asking him the most leading questions you could possibly imagine. And Charles Greenlee described this to the FBI, and after he got done confessing to a rape that he did not commit, he just went back up to his cell, sat down on the floor, and just began to cry because he knew he just solidified his future. He was going to be going to jail for a long time because he said those words, and he had no choice. Willis McCall would kill you, and he did the same exact thing with Jesse Daniels. One of the deputies was choking him from behind, and he stuck the gun to his head and just basically told him to confess.
In order for a conspiracy, this would have to be a conspiracy to get Jesse to Chattahoochee. Obviously, there are people who are considered either public servants or people in the public trust that would have to cooperate in the conspiracy. Talk about that, and what would lead people, other than just blatant racism, to be a part of what Sheriff McCall was trying to do in Lake County?
Yeah, and this is probably the most, I think, disturbing part of the book. When you look at this case, like, in order to get a more, I guess, acceptable story that this Blanche Bosanquet Knowles was sexually assaulted by a white person, in order to make that official story, You have to get people to cooperate and go along with this story. And I think they rationalized it that Jesse Daniels had a mental disability and perhaps he was better off in a state-run facility because of it. Well, Jesse Daniels was not better off in Chattahoochee. We don't really even know the horrors of the things that happened to him at that institute. He was there for 14 years until he was later exonerated. So he spent, a great deal of his life in this horrible place. So you had to have a judge who was willing to commit him. You had to have a state attorney that was willing to go along with it, the sheriff's office. And I think probably the most cynical part of it is when they wanted to get Jesse, they had to get Jesse a lawyer because he couldn't afford one on his own. So the court had to appoint a lawyer. Who did they appoint? One of Willis McCall's best friend, the former state attorney, A.P. Buey. And so A.P. Buey came in, and the first thing he did was write a letter to Chattahoochee saying, between you and me, my client is insane and he's guilty. So that was his representation of Jesse Daniels. And he said, I know you will do this for us. We want you to hold him indefinitely. And that was on his file. And so this was a way of hiding someone and putting this official story out there and not having to take it to court and test it under evidence. They just hid him away.
Before we completely give up on humanity, there are people, black and white, as we go through this story, who did the right thing. Talk about some of those people.
Right, and that's, I think, one of the most interesting parts of this is like when you talk about this depravity and this virulent racism and institutionalized racism, it gives an opportunity for some heroes to rise. And some people did the right thing. Deputy Evie Griffin, believe me, this is a man in a cowboy hat and a buckle, and he's set in his Lake County ways. But when they wanted to execute two wrongly accused men, it was too far. It was too much for him, and so he turned them in. And that was the end of his law enforcement career. This is a man who dreamed about being a deputy since he was a child, and now because he's done this act, he's ruined his law enforcement career because they would never take him anywhere after doing this. And I'd ask him about that, and he said, it was just the wrong thing to do. And, I wouldn't say he was absolutely racially enlightened in a lot of his decisions. He hated Willis McCall by this point. And so he was willing to get back at Willis McCall in a lot of ways. But there was plenty of people who did the right thing. And I think Mable is probably the one who gets the most credit for it. And I just think when they later on exonerated Jesse Daniels, the language in the claims bill to exonerate him pointed out Mabel's efforts, said were it not for the unfailing efforts of a newspaper woman, Jesse Daniels would have spent the rest of his life at Chattahoochee. And so Mable was able to convince a young lawyer to come in and take this case, and for the first time, breathing daylight into the case. And so there were people on both sides of the community in Lake County who really stood up and did the right things. Unfortunately, there were some people who went the other way and sort of turned against the Daniels family.
And just so that the audience know, a claims bill is a legislative referendum to compensate someone for being wrongly incarcerated. In this case, he spent 14 years in Chattahoochee. And he asked the legislature, or at least his lawyer asked the legislature to compensate him for that time. Can you talk a little bit about what ultimately happened there?
Right, and what's interesting is because Jesse never had a trial, the legislator decided with their special master that they had to do a very detailed investigation because they said, if we're going to compensate someone, we have to determine innocence or guilt. And so the attorney in this case from the Legal Aid Society, Richard Graham, he was the one that put forth this claims bill. And he recommended that Jesse be compensated $122,000 based on an hourly wages missed over 14 years. And by the end of this evidence, the special master looked at it and said Jesse Daniels had been placed in the unfortunate circumstance of having to prove his innocence in this case. It's a very difficult thing to do. But after he saw all the evidence, he actually doubled the amount that Jesse Daniels was entitled to. And that was just based on the overwhelming evidence. And we can talk about that when you start to see this conspiracy unravel, when the informants, FBI had some informants, and when things started to go a little bit askew for the Lake County conspirators, it all began to fall apart. And the special master, after one dramatic moment in the testimony, calls a recess, and he goes back into the room with his attorneys and said, someone should write a book about this. I mean, I could not believe what they were seeing.
And speaking of this, and this is, if you want to use the term elephant in the room, when you get this book, when I first got this book, I kind of guessed what it was about. It's obviously, we have Sheriff McCall. We know what kind of sheriff he is from the Groveland case. Obviously, he's setting up an African-American defendant for a rape of a white woman. And that was what I thought.
Right.
And I think it's important at this point because now we know that actually Sheriff McCall was setting up a white person, a white male, for the rape of a white woman. Talk about the dynamics of that and what ultimately, in your opinion, why that was something that Sheriff McCall wanted to do.
Yeah, and I think his first initial instincts was he had narrowed it down to a black suspect, and coincidentally, it was the nephew of Virgil Hawkins, the man trying to integrate the University of Florida. So this was going to be a major embarrassment to Hawkins' efforts to integrate the University of Florida College of Law. And so he proudly displayed this 18-year-old African-American as the suspect. We got him. We got matching shoe prints. We found his underwear at the scene. And then 2 days later, he had to change the whole thing. And the reporters are like, well, what about the matching shoe print? And he's like, nope, we got the right guy this time. And it goes against the instincts of when you're reading this, you recognize, oh, this is going to be a white supremacy thing where we're going to frame an African-American and going to go straight to the death penalty. There's not going to be a lynching. In this particular case, because of the people who were involved, wealthy, powerful people in society, the victim's husband was the mayor of Leesburg, a very powerful man. He was a very big citrus baron. All his friends were in high places. They were society members. And I talked to a grower in Lake County, and I explained to him, because I was having trouble understanding how this was possible. I've never seen anything quite like it. And he didn't bat an eye. He said they had to. Blanche was a flower. She was one of life's flowers, and this would have made her a pariah. They needed a white suspect. And you know, when I talked to people in Lake County about this society, they all said, yeah, that makes complete sense. They would have had to do something like this. And, you know, Blanche remained married to Joe Knowles for 60 years. It's a remarkable thing. And I think in the back of her mind, she always had this thought, that conversation going back to her actual attacker, a man paid me $5,000 to kill you tonight. Don't you want to know who? And part of the book talks about where Joe Knowles was on the night of his wife's attack. And he was having an affair in Tampa with a mistress. And there were rumors going about that he wanted to dispose of his wife and carry on with the mistress. And so that became a thing that the FBI had to investigate. They went through all of the banking files, and they believed it. They were trying to find evidence of it.
There's some fascinating characters, real life characters, and I'm just going to touch upon a few that I'd like you to comment on so that we can get an insight as to your opinion of them. Sam Odom.
You know, Sam Odom was, and this is, there's a little bit of a giveaway in here, but I think it's an interesting story because it pertains to my research. So Sam Odom is one of the kids, 18-year-old, who's picked up in that initial sweep, along with Melvin Hawkins, the nephew of Virgil Hawkins. And they're the two suspects who were released last. Sam Wiley Odom is actually the last person released. And when Pearl was floating around Oklahoma trying to figure out what happened in this case, she went to the mother of Sam Odom, and Sam Odom's mother told Pearl that her son confessed to raping Blanche Knowles. And so in order to frame Jesse Daniels, they had to release Sam Wiley Odom, who they knew to be guilty. And I talked to a deputy, this is very convoluted, but I want you to understand this. I talked to a deputy who was on the force in the time, and he said the way it was dealt with in the days, and he was also in the Klan. He was a Lake County deputy, but he was also in the Klan. And he said we would release that suspect, but he wasn't going to live long. We would take care of him outside of the law. And so the strange thing about Sam Odom was after he gets released, by the Lake County Sheriff's Department, he rapes another woman, and he gets caught. And now the Klan can't get him. Now Sheriff Willis McCall can't get him. He's now in the system. And so it's the electric chair that eventually awaits Sam Wiley Odom. But he has a few words to say to Mable right before he goes. So.
The other thing about this book, and in a couple of minutes we're going to do Q&A, you're a historian, and a lot of people don't realize how big a civil rights struggle occurred here in Florida. Could you tell them briefly about the St. Augustine Movement? Because you talk a lot about that in the book.
I do, and I think it's really important because while Jesse's languishing up at Chattahoochee and his case quiets down, there's really not much to do. Mable is kicked out of Lake County, goes up to Daytona Beach, and starts reporting on the civil rights activity happening in St. Augustine in 1963 and 1964. And what a lot of people don't realize is Florida had more violence in that particular moment in history. There's these incredible photographs. I have one of them in the book where they're starting to do wade-ins in the public beaches and public pools up in St. Augustine. And it's this terrible summer where it's just very, very hot. And they've determined that they're going to do this all summer long, protesting. And the Klan rolls into St. Augustine, and as the African Americans get into the water, the Klan just attacks them night after night. This goes on. They go into the public pools of the hotels, and they have wade-ins. And there's a photograph you can see in the book where these African Americans with white students, and they're just in the middle of the pool, and the owner of the hotel is taking muriatic acid and pouring it into the pool. And what you don't realize, outside those photographs, the Klan is there with their pickup trucks, and they have alligators in the trucks. And they said if they don't get out from the acid, the gators will get them. And so this was the depravity that was happening. Martin Luther King came down here. They were shooting at his cottage several times. The violence nightly was getting on the news, and it really became the impetus for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was almost like the country had seen enough of this. There has to be some kind of legislation to address this. And Mable was covering it. She was up there. She became friendly with Martin Luther King, and this was a very big part of her career, was covering that civil rights strife. But later on, she would say the most important case she ever covered was the story of Jesse Daniels.
And as the book proceeds to its conclusion, you'll be able to, if you haven't read it already, the fate of Sheriff McCall and all of that will come out in it. So it's both a history book and a true life nonfiction that reads like fiction because it's so incredible. No. And so at this time, I think we're going to open it up to any questions. And Kate Alexander is going to help me with that. So does anybody have any questions? And if you could speak up, please, so that all of us can hear you.
We'll repeat the question.
And repeat the question.
Yeah, okay.
I've read other things about how bad it was in Florida, and that Florida was one of the last states to cave in civil rights. And I wondered why there's more focus on other states and hasn't been that much about that time in Florida.
This lady's understanding is that Florida was one of the worst states in the country, yet we haven't had the focus that other southern states have. And why would that be, if there are any thoughts on that?
Well, you're absolutely right about that. In fact, one famous journalist at the time described the Florida Supreme Court as the most racist institution in all of America. No court went as far as Florida's did in preventing and I guess ushering in and advocating for segregation. And so they fought desegregation harder than anyone else. And you see it in the language of the decisions in these. They just were not going to buckle. And Florida, aside from having the highest per capita rate of lynching in the South, Florida did, the violence down here was staggering, and it was off the radar. And one of the things I write about in Devil in the Grove was Florida was considered south of the South. We didn't really know how to think of it. So when these atrocities popped up, people weren't seeing them as civil rights violations for some reason, because Mississippi and Georgia, those were the Cotton Belt South. Florida, we didn't really know how to define. It was a very urban and progressive to the south. Inland was very like the pork chop politics, and we didn't really know how to define it. And so a lot of these cases, like Emmett Till, these kind of cases were happening in Florida, but nobody knows about them. The Groveland Story is a perfect example. We've all heard of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 African Americans falsely accused of rape. None of them were killed. In Florida, 20 years later, 3 of them are shot in the middle of the case, and yet nobody knows about that. Thurgood Marshall was the attorney in this case, and hardly anyone knew about the Groveland case. So it's just a matter of, like, Florida, I really do believe it was just off the radar, and south of the South, the media didn't really know how to report it.
Other questions? I'm going to take one way in the back here. Yeah.
Hey, Bill.
I know that guy.
Chattahoochee, and if you got a chance to go up there and see it.
What is the status of Chattahoochee, and have you got a chance up there to go and see it?
Yeah, I went up there. Unfortunately, the time I was trying to get a tour of Chattahoochee, there had been a couple media articles that came out, and they were not very favorable to conditions there today. And so this New York guy wants to get a tour of Chattahoochee for a book he's writing. Didn't go over too well. So I followed some of my repertorial instincts, thinking of Mable the whole time, and I just walked in and started going to offices, and people were inviting me in to talk. And I still can't believe I did that. And they were telling me things, and I had no clearance at all. Nobody stopped me. And they probably thought I was clearly insane or something myself. But
You would have been in the right place for that.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But I did talk to people. I just wanted to get some history, and I had all the documents I needed because I filed the Freedom of Information Act, and all the medical records, all Jesse's medical records were in there. So I could follow his progression and what had happened to him over the years, how he was being treated, the things that had occurred in his life. And there were also some really impressive reports that came out in the early 60s, interviewing not only the patients, but the guards and the hospital staff. And so they were admitting to a lot of these abuses. And so I really did learn a lot from the reports that were done around the same time Jesse was being held there. But the Florida state mental hospitals were not pleasant places for anyone to be treated at. And, Jesse's story was no different.
And before our last question, there will be a book signing directly after with Mr. King in the lobby. So last question.
In the Times review, it was suggested that Meryl Streep and Frances McDormand were already duking it out for the role of Mable. Have you been hurt by any movie producers?
I've been on the road for the last 2 weeks, and I really have not been checking in on any of that stuff. I have not heard anything about Meryl Streep and Frances McDormand except in Jeffrey Toobin's review, which would make a lot of sense. It's this is honestly this role of this woman facing bombs and terrorists and the Klan and just not backing down against this sheriff and just never quitting. She wrote hundreds of articles about Jesse Daniels' case over the years. And, she was ultimately credited with saving Jesse's life. And I think this beautiful friendship that she has with Pearl, Jesse's mother, I just think it's a meaty kind of a role for a woman, a great actress. And it's interesting because I've done 2 books before Beneath the Ruthless Sun, and a lot of the women were kind of in the background. It was the men who were out doing things, and the women played this supporting role. And so it was just such a relief to get these characters who were so full of life and just did not back down. Pearl is telling J. Edgar Hoover what to do, and I talked to Jesse's lawyer, Richard Graham, was this young lawyer, and he said, I got to Lake County, I was terrified, and Mabel was like, get behind me. And you can't make this stuff up. She would just literally go look him right in the eyes and walk, and he didn't know how to react to her. So I just think there's just really colorful moments and characters that are, these are real people that existed, and they're documented. Their correspondence and their acts are all documented. I just think, I have larger-than-life female characters. I even say Blanche Bosanquet Knowles is a really interesting character because she refuses to go along with this. You can imagine the pressure that's being put on her by the judge, the state attorney, her own husband, to sort of go along with the story, and she's not backing down. And she does something very interesting towards the end of the book. And when it's obvious that this case had been on her mind, she went and got her master's degree in special education and went to the high school that Jesse would have attended and taught special ed to mentally disabled kids. So there was definitely something within all three of those women that I thought were pretty special.
Judge Williams, I'll turn it to you to wrap things up. Thank you.
What I'd like to do is end this on a question that I think I know that I'm curious about, and after you've done 5 years of research and even longer on some of the other things that you've done as it relates to criminal justice and social justice, and in light of everything that's happening today. So my final question for you, and you can elaborate as much as you want for the next few minutes, what does this book tell us or teach us about where we are today, especially as it relates to criminal justice reform and race relations?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've spent so much time looking through these files and sort of these unknown cases that just don't see the light of day because there's not enough evidence or the statute of limitations has passed. I think one of the things that it made me very sensitive to was a lot of the things that were happening to African Americans in these communities, missing persons, all right? So someone who maybe is a picker, who's starting to organize some of the pickers for better wages, all of a sudden disappears. And the official response, when the families say, where is our family member, the official response from law enforcement, he probably went up to one of the northern cities and got a job. You'll hear from him. And they just disappeared, and they wouldn't just disappear. I see a lot of these cases where a deputy wants to talk to somebody, and they'll take a young African American out in the night and want to ask him some questions, and they'll step out into the darkness, and then there's a gunshot. And you look at the report, and it just says, the deputy says, he went for my gun. And there's no other story. The coroner's report are made up of the deputy's friends and the sheriff's friends. And there's community pressure to just say it was self-defense. He told us that. And so these are some of the things, when you look at Bryan Stevenson and the lynching memorial in the museums, these are outside of the areas of lynching. These are murders, basically. But they're lynchings in a way that don't count because maybe you don't have a body or maybe there's no defense to this. And so I think communities are touched by this. So when today you see a shooting that seems suspicious or anywhere, north, south, it doesn't matter, I think there's a residue of just this conspiracies that the system was working against them to protect law enforcement. And they've been touched by it in the communities. So you can imagine the outrage because it's generally touched many different families across the United States. And those are the stories we don't hear about. They're not in the newspapers. They're in these coroner's reports and these FBI reports. And for some reason, there's just not enough evidence to go forward with indictments. But the reports are damning. And one of the things I read in one of the FBI reports, when they realized they couldn't go forward with these cases and they were basically quashed, one of the agents was bothered by it. And he says, I was told to stop for the tranquility of the South. In other words, if people really knew what was happening, they might riot in the streets. And so that is my takeaway, is to just understanding some of the things that were happening in these communities behind the scenes that you don't really know about, that show up in all these reports, missing persons, and just to recognize that there's this legacy of this kind of pain that reaches a community, and trying to understand it is an important, I think it's a duty for all Americans.
Again, the book is Beneath a Ruthless Sun, a true story of violence, race, and justice lost and found. I hope we realize how privileged we are to have Gilbert King here in Sarasota. He has been a friend and supporter of Florida Studio Theater. He's come down here and he's done these things really for no pay.
I get to see great plays.
But he does get to see great plays. And I can't tell you how much we appreciate you doing this, and we appreciate you writing this book. I encourage you to buy it and read it. It is a life-changing book, and it is something I think that we can learn from as we go forward, because we don't want to repeat history, but we need to learn from it. So thank you very much, Gilbert.
Thank you, Charles. Appreciate it. My pleasure. That was great, as usual.